can you see the future? In other words, the question, if you're sitting at home right now worried about your job or your business, whatever you worry about, is what does the future hold? And that's why this is probably the most important program, but it's not. See, most people just watch the stock market. That's all they watch. They don't know much about whether much the home prices in their neighborhood. And that's not good enough. So our guest today is George Gammon. He's my new hero. He takes the ultra complex and puts it in pictures. So you have a chance. His program is called Rebel Capitalist on YouTube. Please follow him. Even if you don't understand him at first, just keep tracking with him, because you're going to see what 99.99% of the world's population will never see. Because what George puts into pictures is the real cash flowing through the monetary system. This is an oil refinery. So every time I watch George's whiteboard presentation, he's actually showing us part of the plumbing. And the reason plumbing is important, it goes back to cash flow. Because when you're looking at this plumbing, I'm watching the cash flow. So the pipes, all of these oil pipes and refinery pipes are showing the direction of flow of oil and gas and all those other things. So the way you predict the future, you've got to watch the cash flowing, because most people have no financial education. Their cash keeps flowing out. Number one is taxes. Number two is they buy that house they call an asset, but it's actually cash flowing out to the bank. And number three is your 401k or your IRA, whatever you've got. The cash is always flowing out. But George has the power to take this and put it into pictures like this on his whiteboard. And the reason you want to study what George is saying, because he's going to keep you up to date on which way the cash is flowing. It is the most important thing a person can do. So you want to see the future. You want to see which way cash flows. So what George is talking about is this chart here. This was a subprime crash up here, 2008.
Yep.
And he entered the market down here. And that's what smart guys do. Most guys were running, but he entered the market right here. Kim and I entered right there also. Mm-hmm. We borrowed $300 million with Kenny McElroy, and we thought we died and went to heaven. And right now, the cash is flowing out at high speeds. Yeah. And George talks about it, calls it the repo market. The average person doesn't know what the repo market is. And that's where the hemorrhaging is taking place.
And so what are you seeing in the future, George?
Well, going back to September 17th in the repo market, we saw interest rates spike almost up to 10%, which was totally unprecedented. Usually it follows the Fed funds, which was, call it 1%, 2%, right around there. So if you see this happening, you know that there's something wrong underneath the water. You're seeing the tip of the iceberg. You're seeing the top of that wave, but you know underneath there's a lot of problems. And that's what prompted Robert to take some action. So yep. I think what I want to stress, and I'll explain this just momentarily, but what I really want to stress to the viewer is that if you're able to just start to understand the macroeconomic picture, and it doesn't need to be complex. Listen, the reason you think it's complex is because all these economists and academics, they use all this jargon and technical terms, but if you just break it down into simple English, it's actually very easy for people to understand. And if they understand it, they're going to be able to make much better decisions for themselves and their family in the future for their finances. So whether it's me or anyone else, make sure that you're trying to really pay attention to what's going on. I think the average viewer might be listening to this saying, okay, Robert, I get it, but how does this apply to me? Let me dive into that. So we were talking about the repo market as an example, and Robert, you have that great picture of the oil rig and all the plumbing going back and forth. That's basically the dollar funding market. So how it applies to the average Joe and Jane. Let's just say that you you've been saving your money, you've been working hard, you've been doing all the right things, you've got a little nest egg saved up, and you go to the bank and you're like, oh my gosh, they're only giving me 0.5 interest or 0 or who knows what it is. You can't even see the interest rates. They're so small nowadays. So you say, okay, where can I go to get a little bit higher rate of return? But I still want to be safe. It's got to be safe. So then you might look at a product like a money market mutual fund or a money market fund. And then you look at this, you say, well, that's safe. All my buddies are doing it. It's just like a bank account, but I get maybe a 1.5% return. Well, what the average person doesn't realize is they're taking exponentially more risk just to get that 1% additional return. So how is that? Because the way that the money market mutual fund gets the additional return is they take your hard-earned savings and money and they put it into the repo market, or they put it into the commercial paper market, which is basically funding for corporations, the same type of thing. So the question then becomes that person that's just watching Monday Night Football and just enjoying life, just, with the white picket fence, the two kids, the golden retriever, they don't care about what's going on with the plumbing. They don't care about the dollar swaps. But does that person really want to lend their hard-earned savings to Deutsche Bank, to HSBC, some of these banks that could be crumbling as we speak, or to put things into other terms, like more America-centric corporate terms? Would that individual want their money being lent to American Airlines right now, or Boeing right now, where every single time you turn on CNBC or the TV, you see that they're asking for another bailout because they're about to go bust? That's how this macro, and that's how the cash flow and the plumbing that Robert's talking about, that's how, just one way that it can affect the everyday person. It's not just the banks, it's the government, it's the private sector, it's our entire economy, because these debt cycles run in courses of 75 to 100 years. I'm going back to Ray Dalio, and Ray Dalio has some great YouTube videos on this, but he's got charts of the long-term debt cycles and the short-term debt cycles. Long story short, right now we're at the top of a 75 to 100-year long-term debt cycle. So the only way from here is down. And Robert, you call this in a lot of your books, and you kind of predicted this and had the foresight to see this coming. But when you get to the top of one of these debt cycles, the only thing the government can do, well, there's 4 ways out of it. Number one, they can choose austerity, which very few governments do, and that's just tightening the belt, spending less. Everyone feels the pain. Think of the deflation or depression we had in the 1930s. Or they restructure the debt. Well, it's not likely we're going to do that with China. It's not likely we're going to do that with the big banks because they're the creditors. Or they could just default, say, hey, we're not paying you. Or what most governments do is they choose money printing. This is creating inflation to bail out all the people who have the debt, whether it's governments, whether it's individuals. So once you get debt to a certain level, you've got to, well, you don't have to, but most governments choose to inflate it away. So what does that mean for the average person? Well, if the government is going to try to create inflation, meaning the cost of goods and services going up, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're positioned for that. So as an example, if you just own your own home, you've got to make sure that you've got a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, because if they try to create inflation, if interest rates go up, then your interest rate is going to go up unless it's fixed. And what happens when you're a debtor and they create inflation, you're going to have the opportunity to pay the loan back, your mortgage, with cheaper devalued dollars. So the way they can think about that is if they borrow, let's say $100,000, the rate of interest means that they're paying the bank back with increased purchasing power because you've got principal plus interest. So what happens in inflation, though, is inflation allows the borrower to pay the debt back with less purchasing power. So if your rate of interest, let's say, is 1% or 3%, we'll call it, but if inflation goes up to 5-6%, the delta between those two is a transfer of purchasing power from the bank to the individual homeowner. And I think a lot of people listening to this probably have a mortgage, if not on a rental property, on their own home. And I think that's the very first thing they can do to be proactive. Also, gold, silver, Bitcoin, you talk about that all the time. And I could continue to go on, but that's where I'd start.